are strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee.
Catch us up on the first part of chapter 46 that we covered last week. Jacob has been approached about going to Egypt. He's a little bit hesitant, and he receives a divine message encouraging him not to fear going to Egypt, and God promises to make him a great nation there. He's accompanied by his sons and their families. They travel to Beersheba. In Beersheba, he stops. Anybody remember why he stopped in Beersheba? To offer a sacrifice. That's correct. He had a vision that night. God reassured Jacob, tells him that his descendants are going to become a numerous and mighty nation in Egypt. That's verses 5 through 7 of the chapter. And then there's that long list of all of the descendants of Jacob that accompanied him to Egypt. They total 70 individuals, it says in verse 27, which is where we stopped last time. This was Jacob's sons, his grandsons, and his great-grandsons. Joseph, of course, is already in Egypt. He prepares to meet his father in Goshen. We don't know a whole lot about Goshen, just so you know. They think they know where there's a traditional place for Goshen near a wadi in the fertile area of Egypt. That is just what they kind of piece together. They don't know for certain. And I'll also mention this, and we're going to talk about this some tonight probably. It's referred to as the best of the land a couple of times in chapter 46 and 47. What isn't clear? Well, I'm 54 years old now, and I've been in Bible classes since I was 4. And up until this week, I always read that as it was the best land in all of Egypt. And then I read someone else that suggested that since how it comes from Pharaoh's mouth, we're going to read that part, I think, tonight, that basically Joseph says, we want to go to Goshen, and he says, that's fine, take the best of the land. That possibly that best of the land means that they were in the best part of Goshen, not necessarily the best part of the entire nation. That is a potential reading for that seems legitimate to me, so I just wanted to throw that out there. It is fertile, but the reason why that you would potentially read it that way, and we're going to notice this again tonight, is Joseph actually coaches his brothers on what to say to Pharaoh to help ensure that they get what they're asking for. And one of the things he tells them is, you need to let him know that you are sheep herders. And what I'm told from the scholarship is that sheep herders, shepherds were not particularly well liked by the Egyptians, which indicates that Goshen would have been separated from the main living areas of Egypt, the places where they had taken up residence. If you put those two pieces of information together, that Goshen was an area that was not highly inhabited, and he was willing to let shepherds live there because they didn't really want them around, then it would make sense. Now, there is another explanation, because it was part of the Nile Delta region, presumably, and what happens in the Nile Delta region every year? It floods. So guess what smart people don't do? They don't build houses where it floods every year. Not making any comment about anybody or anything or anywhere, I'm just saying that's what, you go, you know what? It doesn't flood here. We can plant our crops there and get all the benefits and just not live there. But anyway, that is one of the reasons why that alternate reading is put out there. And I think that there is some reasonableness to the thinking about that. Since now we don't know exactly where it is, and we don't know a whole lot about it beyond what we're told here in this part of Genesis, we need to be careful not to become too dogmatic about any of it beyond what it says. Anybody know or remember, we did read this last week, what the primary reason why Joseph selected, or not the primary reason, but at least one of the top reasons why Joseph selected Goshen? So they would be near him. I think that's back in verse 10 of chapter 45. You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children and your flocks and your herds and all that you have. So apparently it was in the same general region of the nation that Joseph lived in, close enough where they could see one another from time to time. Near is one of those relative words. Near and far are relative terms. My mother lives near to me compared to my brother. My brother lives in Atlanta. My mother lives just on the other side of the border with Texas. It's about 115 miles to my mom's house, a little bit further than that to my brother's house. So I would say that she lives near to me, but she doesn't live near to me the way that we'd use that term about in town. I mean, there are things that are 4 miles from me that I don't consider near my house. So near is one of those relative terms. The indication being they were close enough that Joseph would be able to see them. So that was one of the reasons why he knew that it would be good land for them, for what their purposes were, and that they would be near him. So that's what we know about that. So he's already there. He's preparing to meet his father. And the chapter is, or verse 28, I guess, concludes with or the chapter ultimately concludes with the reuniting of them together. All of the things that this passage, that this chapter emphasize, God's fulfillment of his promises. Some of these promises were made, and God actually sees him through. His active participation in leading them and encouraging and strengthening and all that other stuff. God
chose family or genealogy to family. Why was it the Israelites, not some other?
Yeah, well, what I can tell you is he chose Abraham. Now, we're going to key off of Abraham in terms of what we talked about this past Sunday night in the sermon. Abraham was a great man of faith. In fact, the Bible calls him the man of faith. So Abraham was chosen by God. Then Isaac was chosen long before Isaac was born. And then Isaac had two sons, right? Jacob and Esau. Jacob was the younger, but Jacob got chosen because God, and that just has reference to the fact that Jacob was chosen over Esau. But again, that goes back to even at the birth scenario that was revealed. So anyway, Jacob is who became Israel. So that's how we get to Jacob. Now, we're learning in this book how we get to Judah from Jacob. And then from Judah, ultimately, you go to David. In fact, the only person that I can, off the top of my head, I'm not saying that there isn't any other reference to any other families anywhere else, but the only other person I can think of that's mentioned in a prophetic way pertaining to the lineage is David's father, Jesse, is mentioned. But other than that, we don't hear much about the individuals between Judah and David, as far as which ones within the family line are actually chosen. You can follow it back if you look at the lineages, but we don't see nearly as much micro pictures of the individuals. It's more of a macro picture as we go through the remainder of the story. So anyway, it all starts with Abraham's faith. And that's also very significant because, for instance, and for those of you that were here when we did the number study, you'll recall the first generation didn't enter into the promised land. It was their sons that did, the second generation. And when they entered, God made it a point to tell them, it's not because of you. It's not that you're somehow special and better and more deserving. That's a lesson that was, well, it fell on deaf ears, quite frankly, because part of the problem that is discussed in the New Testament, in the early parts of the New Testament, are the attitudes of the Jews that ultimately believed what? That they were something special. They weren't. In fact, God's promise had always been that blessings would come to all mankind. He was just using those people to bring about the blessing to all mankind. And again, we touched on this very briefly Sunday night, but that promise that he would be the father of many nations that came to Abraham, that was really about his spiritual descendants, not his physical descendants, although his physical descendants also made up many physical nations. But in fact, he had, between his two sons, two great nations that arose from him. Ishmael and Isaac both were the father of great nations of people. And but the real intent is we're all sons of Abraham by faith. And so as we read through this, we need to keep that in mind as well, that really the focus is always on what God is doing, not for them, but through them to bring his promised Messiah. Abraham was not the promised Messiah. Neither was Isaac, neither was Jacob, neither was Judah, neither was David. Jesus was the promised Messiah. And there was something that set Jesus apart in that lineage. Anybody know what that is? But besides the low-hanging fruit answer, which is that he was God. He was a descendant of Judah. He was a descendant of David. He was all of those things, but there was something quite unique about Jesus that isn't true about anybody in that line, and that is he was conceived of the Holy Spirit. That made him quite unique. And so the rest of these folks are conceived through natural processes. But then you have Jesus, who's born of a virgin, because the Holy Spirit came upon her. And so all of this is about God fulfilling that promise and how God fulfilled that promise. And this whole little diversion to Egypt foreshadows the fact that Jesus would spend time in Egypt. But it's also to preserve this people and to give them an incubator in which they could become the nation that they would later be. They go into this situation numbering 70 people. They leave as a nation. Now that's a significant thing. And then there's a lot of wealth we're going to read about being collected by Egypt. And we're going to find out they leave with all that wealth too. And we're going to find out that the way Egypt got all that wealth was through the leadership of Joseph. That's part of tonight's study. So anyway, all that's going on. We're picking up in verse 28. Now he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way before him to Goshen. Okay, so Judah's been back and forth a couple of times. He says, you go ahead and I'll follow. And they came into the land of Goshen. And Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. And then Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I've seen your face, that you're still alive. Now, this is an expression. He's not actually saying, I want to die. He's saying what? My life is complete. I don't need anything else. I have now seen you alive. I couldn't even dream of needing, everybody has things that they'd like to do or see before they die lists. I'd like to do this. I'd like to see this. Or even if it's not even that formal, you hear people saying, I'd like to grow up to see my grandchildren. And I'd like to see, he lost Joseph. He never thought he would see him again. Now he's seen him alive. He's like, what more could I ask for in life? I've seen and experienced the greatest thing that I could hope for has now become reality. I've seen you alive. And so that's all that he's saying in that statement. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh, I will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. And it shall come about when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? Now, you hear how he's laying this out. He says, I'm going to go into Pharaoh and I'm going to tell Pharaoh all the stuff about you. But he is going to call you before him. And the first thing he's going to want to know from you is what's your occupation. When he says, what's your occupation, you shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen. So there's something about them being shepherds that immediately would make Pharaoh go, Goshen's where you need to be. For every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. Now that's the next qualifier in this that becomes important. What that tells us is that apparently Goshen is somewhere away from the body of the Egyptians. If these people are loathsome to the Egyptians, they don't want to say, yeah, move in next door. They want to put them somewhere more isolated and away from them. And so that's what he says. Be sure and let him know that you're shepherds. And when you tell him that, then he'll be perfectly happy with Goshen. Joseph went in, told Pharaoh, this is the beginning of chapter 47, and said, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they're in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers, and he presented them to Pharaoh. We're never told, I don't think, which 5 these men are. He just took 5 of his brothers. He had coached them. This is the important thing. He had told them what they needed to say. We do this all the time. Political candidates get coached as to how and what they should speak. By the way, that's why you end up hearing these guys, especially this time of year. If you watch TV for more than 12 minutes, you'll see 2 separate clips of the same person speaking in 2 different places, essentially saying exactly the same thing both times. You want to know why? Because they were told, this is what you need to say, and this is how you need to say it. We also do that with witnesses in court cases. Our witnesses given depositions, their attorneys sit them down and they coach them. You're going to get asked this question. When you're asked this question, answer it like this. We do this kind of thing all the time. It's not anything new. It's always been done. That's exactly what Joseph had done with his brothers. He told them exactly how to respond to the questions that he anticipated Pharaoh would ask. Now, how could he anticipate Pharaoh's questions? He had been there with him for a long time. He had been his right-hand man. He had seen it. He knew Pharaoh. He knew what he was going to ask. He knew how he was going to respond to the situation. And so he coached them. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" They said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers." They said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land." Important language there. Sojourn in the land. What's sojourn mean? To stay, but to stay not permanent, not to settle in the land. But we're going to sojourn here. We're going to stay here for a while, but we're not going to stay here forever. We've come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal." Now that's been the case for years at this point. We're in the second or third year of the famine, whatever it is. And so he's been there at least, we'll go with 9 to 10 years. He's been in charge of the land all of that time. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Again, that's where I was talking about in the introduction. Whether that's the best of the land of Goshen or the best of the land of Egypt is not super clear. It seems reasonable to read that as the best of the land of Goshen. And Goshen was a region of Egypt that clearly was somewhat segregated from the rest of the Egyptians. And he's basically saying, okay, that's fine. They can go there and give them the best that's at their disposal. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock. I'd also surmise from this, again, this is not a hard and fast, this must be, but based on the information that's here, I would surmise that that is the region where they kept their livestock as well. But again, keepers of livestock were loathsome to the Egyptians. Little Egyptian kids didn't grow up saying, "Ooh, I hope I can be a rancher someday." And so basically what Pharaoh says is, yeah, let them settle there, give them the best land. And by the way, if there's any of them that are particularly good herdsmen, put them in charge of my livestock. Joseph brought his father, Jacob, and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And so Joseph's brought in to meet Pharaoh at this point, and he offers a blessing on Pharaoh. Is Pharaoh a follower of the God of heaven? Ooh, is it okay for him to bless him then? Apparently so. There's not anything. In fact, he does it again before he leaves. So I bring that up because sometimes Christians get this mindset of, oh, if they're not believers, we can't even pray for them. I don't find that in my study of the Bible. In fact, I would suggest that we have direct instructions contrary to that. Leaders are not all followers of God, but we're told expressly to pray for them. So anyway, just kind of keep that in mind, that the way he greets Pharaoh is to offer him a blessing. So Jacob said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How many years have you lived?" Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my sojourning are 130. So we know that he's 130 years old at this point. We're going to find out, I think he's 147 when he dies, if memory serves me correct. So that means he's about 17 years before he dies at this juncture. But he's 130 when he gets to Egypt. Listen to how he describes those years. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life. Again, words like few and many are defined by the context. They're relative terms. Why does he say his years were few? Well, that's why they were miserable. But why were his years few? He was 130 years old. How many of you would say, if you're 130 years old, I've only lived for a few years? Well, the truth of the matter is, his father had lived longer than that. His grandfather had lived longer than that. He was old, and life was not pleasant. And it was clear to him at this point that he was not going to have as long and fruitful life as Abraham had had, as Isaac had had. And so his life was going to be shorter than theirs. And he's expressing that. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years of that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. So again, that's how it ends. And went out from his presence. So it opened with him blessing Pharaoh. It ends with him offering a blessing to Pharaoh on his way out. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession of the land of Egypt in the best of the land of Ramesses. Now, Ramesses was one of the kings, and so apparently this was a region of the country that he had either dwelled in or possessed or whatever, as Pharaoh had ordered. And Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to their little ones. So they get settled in, and Joseph gives them some food. Now, what's going to happen in the next few verses here is a little odd. It's kind of regressive. Okay, this is what happened after they settled exactly. It's kind of an overview of this whole period of time. There was no food in the land because the famine was very severe. So the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Okay, so there had been 7 years of plenty. Now we're in the midst of this famine, and it's a bad famine. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money to Pharaoh's house. Okay, verse 14. This is early in the famine. Famine hits, people start running out of food. What do? They go to the government and say, we need food. Joseph says, you know what? For 7 years, I took that tax from you, and I built these cities and all these stores. I got all this grain. This is what it's for. We're going to sell it to you. So they start buying the grain from Joseph until they're out of money. Then what do? When the money was all spent, verse 15, in the land of Egypt, in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food, for why should we die in your presence? We still need food. We don't have any money anymore. Our money is now gone. Joseph said, give up your livestock, and I'll give you food for your livestock. In other words, all right, you don't have any money anymore, but you still have your animals. Sell your animals to me. I'll give you food for your animals. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for their horses and their flocks and their herds and their donkeys. And he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said, well, we'll not hide from my Lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my Lord's. There is nothing left for my Lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? And so basically, they've spent all their money, they've sold all their livestock. They don't really have anything left to offer except for themselves and their property. And they say, what? What good is myself and my property if I die? So I'll offer you my property and myself. buy us and our land for food, we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So this is a completely change in the economic system in Egypt, where the people in Egypt who had been independent operators in a, we'll call it a capitalist type economy, are now government dependent. They don't have anything else. They now are servants of the government. They don't own land. They don't own livestock. They don't have money. They just do what they're told to do in exchange for food. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate. So they were doing two things. He was not only giving them grain for food, but also giving them grain to do what? Plant for what it's worth. Again, we're in the middle of a famine. We're not getting a whole lot of return, but you are still growing as much food as you can. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every Egyptian sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. This is one of the ways that the Egyptian pharaohs became the super powerful people that they were. I'm going to tell you something. To this very day, if you have money and you have property, you have power. And it was all, the entire nation's wealth was concentrated in one house. Pharaoh's house. That happened because of Joseph's management, not because of Pharaoh's management. Now you know why Pharaoh liked Joseph so much. This is a story. It's very possible that it may play some role in that. As for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy. For the priest had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them, therefore they did not sell their land. So the priest had a special standing. They were paid by the government. As a result of that, they didn't have to sell their land because they got their allotment. And that actually made them a more privileged class than the average person in Egypt. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have today bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you may sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh." Okay, so what's a fifth? 20%. So basically he says, what we need to think of this arrangement as being very similar to a sharecropper arrangement. Very similar to what took place in feudal Europe. That land all belonged to the king. He would then grant land to individuals. They would farm the land and then give a portion of their proceeds to the king. And that was their cost of operating the land. By the way, if you were particularly good and skilled at what you did, guess what happened? You got given bigger pieces of land. And eventually you worked your way up, and you might even become a lord at some point that ruled over a whole section that had tenants under you. And our current land law in this country, based off of that system. Which is why, for instance, the government can come in and say, we need to use this land, we're going to take it. Because that's what the king could do. So eminent domain is a doctrine that arose from this type of an arrangement. So anyway, he's like, all right, you go back on this property, but we own the property now, and you're our servants. So I'm going to give you the seed to plant. You plant it, but there's a 20% tax that comes back to us. 4 fifths shall be your own food, for seed of the field, and for your food, and for those of your household, and as food for your little ones. And so you get 4 fifths of whatever you produce, and that's got to be your food and your seed for next year. So you have to produce and continue to produce year after year after year. You have to manage this. And every year when your crops come in, 20% of it comes back to Pharaoh, because this is Pharaoh's land. And you work for him. So they said, you've saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of our Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves. They are perfectly happy at this juncture to go into this relationship. Now, why? That's exactly right. That's what we need to understand. We need to understand just how desperate the situation was. Listen, I don't think anybody sitting in this room would think it'd be a good deal for you to cede your property to the government and then live your life and be responsible for everything and then be taxed 20% back to the government. You got to feed yourself. You got to keep your business going. But you get a 20% tax off the top that goes back to the government. And by the way, you don't own your land anymore. It now belongs to the government. Not any of us would go, hey, that's a good deal. I want that deal. But they were in such desperate straits, their options in their mind was what? That or die. And that's better than death. So we're grateful for this. You've saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of our Lord. We will be Pharaoh's slaves. Interesting story. The Hebrews just came in, and while all the Egyptians were losing their land and becoming slaves of Pharaoh, Pharaoh is giving land to the Hebrews, and they're independent. Interesting dynamics there. Maybe that has something to do with why the Egyptians put the Hebrews in bondage later. But anyway, just an interesting dynamic. All that's going on as they come in. They're losing their lands. They're becoming slaves of Pharaoh. And then these foreigners come in, and Pharaoh's giving them land. And not just any land, but the best land in Goshen. And Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen. They acquired property in it. They were fruitful. They became very numerous. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. And when the time for Israel to die drew near, by the way, Israel and Jacob, the same person. When the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand under my thigh and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Please do not bury me in Egypt. But when I lay down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. Okay. I still don't understand that posture for making deals. I don't know why you'd stick your hand under somebody's thigh to make a deal. That just seems weird, but that's what they did. He basically says, assume the position of making a promise. When I die, don't bury me here. Bring me home. And Joseph says, absolutely. I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. So that is how this happened. That's how 70 people became a great nation. And how an Egyptian people became leery of them because they were losing everything and the Hebrews were gaining everything. All right. Anybody have any questions or comments? I'm out of time. Lord willing, we will pick up next time 47, 48. 48. Hey, we did good tonight. Thanks.